I recently had an interesting argument with someone when we were watching The Godfather. She claimed that while she appreciates the film for its numerous qualities, she did not like how the story was hard to follow, as she put it. She said that while she sometimes likes to watch films with me that ask the viewer to really concentrate, she usually prefers films that are, story-wise, more accessible. I think this is a very valid point. The Godfather has a million things that make it amazing, from the blocking, which could get its own essay, to the stellar acting, etc. But it's true that the story is complex. I too was lost when I watched the film for the first time, and it got to the point where the families meet to arrange peace among them, where Don Corleone, sitting in the car afterwards, says,
"But I didn't know until this day that it was Rossini all along."
Wait, who? You just threw like 15 family names in my face. I don't remember which one this name belongs to. Anyways, I made the assumption that she preferred more accessible films. She disagreed with me, however. She found that accessible sounded demeaning when applied to a work of art. And that was the point when I realized that a film could be both accessible and complex. To elaborate on this, let's compare The Godfather and Yorgos Lanthimos' The Lobster. You're probably wondering if I've lost my marbles at this point, and I'm not even blaming you. So let's look at the narrative complexity of both films. The story of The Lobster can basically be told in one sentence. A guy is sent to a hotel to find a partner. If he doesn't, he's transformed into an animal. He flees and finds love, or maybe not. This is a fairly accessible story. The story of The Godfather, however, with its trillion characters and subplots, is definitely complex in this department. So, narratively, one might argue that The Lobster is the more accessible film of the two. But let's forget about the denotation of both stories and look instead at the connotation. What's it actually about? Well, in case of The Godfather, it's a mafia story about a man of power losing said power, and about a man who is forced to take action when nobody else will, disregarding his own interests. But The Lobster? There is so much weird shit going on. There's the animal symbolism, which you could write a separate analysis for, based on every single character and their particular animal of choice. There is the critique of heteronormative relationships as a social standard. There is also a critique towards those who are just as proud of being single. There is the notion that human mating rituals, based on superficial commonalities, are ridiculous. There is the idea that bisexuality is still not as accepted as homosexuality. The idea that couples have children just to save their relationship, and so much more. So, the point here is, narratively, The Godfather is much more complex than The Lobster. But when it comes to semantic complexity, The Lobster takes the cake. And thus, both films are complex, just on other levels. The same can be applied to other films. Most of the films by David Lynch, for example, show how a film can be both narratively and semantically complex. Obviously, this can be applied to literature as well. While I enjoy both types of complexity when it comes to films, for books I always preferred those that were rather semantically complex than narratively. For example, I adore the works of Franz Kafka, but I always had a hard time with, say, Tolstoy, for example. I just never could quite put my finger on why. I appreciate Tolstoy's beautifully constructed sentences and his numerous ingenious characters, but there was one issue I had with War and Peace. I kept losing track of who was who. After 20 pages, I had to go back to understand which aristocrat the narrator is talking about, and I mean, there's a lot of them. 559 to be exact. I'm serious, look it up. So, this could perhaps be considered the epitome of a complex narrative. Semantically, however, not so much. Now let's look at Franz Kafka's Die Verwandlung. What's going on here? Well, it's pretty clear. The protagonist, Gregor Samsa, turns into an insect, gets rejected by his family, and eventually dies as an apple is thrown at him. Pretty clear, right? Well, narratively certainly, but otherwise, not really. One reason why I love Kafka is that he has this very clear language. He always describes what is happening as accurately as no other author I've read. But the contents of his stories are incredibly absurd, and that's the beauty of it. He tells you exactly what is going on, while the plot might be downright weird. Few authors have probably sparked as many wide discussions about the symbolism in their work. I'm not going to list the motifs sprinkled throughout his literary work here. This will have to wait for a separate essay. The point is, I love Kafka for his narrative accessibility. I could just start reading and never stop. It's not exhausting to read his stories. At the same time, I love his symbolic complexity. There's just so much room for interpretation in his works. This doesn't mean that I consider War and Peace worse in any way. Like The Lobster and The Godfather, both War and Peace and Die Verwandlung have their own undeniable qualities. It's just that I, personally, enjoy Kafka's literature more. So, in short, both accessibility and complexity can be qualities, whether they apply to the connotation or the denotation of a narrative. Of course, you could start the same discussion for non-narrative films and literature, or even other forms of art, but that's not the point of this essay. That being said, I believe in accessibility. I realized this recently when looking at my own videos. This is why I'll try to stick with shorter essays in the future that get right to the point and avoid unnecessary digressions. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoy this type of content, you could do me a huge favor by leaving a like or subscribing. While writing this essay, I was wondering if I should make an essay on the symbolism in Kafka's literary work. What do you think? Tell me in the comments.